When the bitter winds of winter swept through Lancaster, Jacob's neighbors mocked his foolish stove-box. A simple invention built from stone and scrap metal, it stood in stark contrast to the warm hearths of his fellow farmers. Yet, as the season wore on and the temperatures plummeted, it was Jacob's humble creation that proved to be the only true source of warmth in the valley. This is the story of a man who, in the face of ridicule, trusted in his ingenuity, knowing that sometimes the simplest answers lie hidden in plain sight. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of quiet perseverance and simple wisdom, join us for tomorrow's tale. Jacob Stoltzfus sat at his kitchen table, the faint glow of the oil lamp flickering in the corner of the room. Outside, the wind howled, bending the barren branches of the trees near his farm. Snow had begun to fall earlier than expected this year, covering the earth with a thick, unyielding blanket. It wasn't just another winter, it was shaping up to be one of the harshest the region had seen in years. Inside the cabin, the air felt colder than usual. The warmth from the hearth barely reached the far corners of the room, and even in the heart of his home, the chill seemed to cling to everything. Jacob had long known that his neighbors' methods of heating their homes were temporary fixes, fires burning low, smoke rising lazily up the chimney. The old stone fireplace in his living room, though once a prized feature of his home, wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay anymore. Jacob had seen the problem for years, and now, with the first major snowstorm of the season already upon him, he could see it even more clearly. The cold didn't care about tradition. It didn't care about hearths or pride. As a young boy, Jacob had spent many nights in his father's workshop, learning the ways of wood and stone, of building with a quiet patience. He was used to the hum of tools in his hands, the rhythm of his work as it slowly took shape into something useful. But this problem, this cold, was different. The stoves his neighbors had relied on only added heat to the space closest to the fire. The rooms beyond the hearths remained cold, and the firewood burned too quickly, leaving nothing to warm them through the night. Jacob had to find something better, something that would solve the problem in a way no one else had thought to try. He spent 3 days working in his workshop, measuring, cutting, and piecing together what seemed like a strange contraption, a box stove made of iron plates, built on a stone base with air vents at the sides and a chimney that would direct the heat to the center of the room. It was simple, but its design was something entirely new to the community. Jacob was not one for showy designs. He had learned long ago that practicality was the only true measure of a creation's worth. His neighbors didn't see it that way. When Jacob revealed his creation, his friends laughed. Jacob, his closest neighbor, Ezra, had said, "This is no more than a box. You're wasting your time building a heater when you could be stacking firewood for the real cold." But Jacob had always trusted his instincts, and the stove box, as they called it, was more than just a box. It was his solution, his faith in ingenuity over tradition, and as the cold continued to bite deeper into the bones of Lancaster, Jacob's belief would be tested. The first night Jacob fired up the stove box, the wind had already begun to howl again. The snowstorm had shifted into a relentless downpour of ice, and Jacob's cabin stood in the heart of the storm, surrounded by an unforgiving world. The stove box sat in the corner of the room, its dark iron surface cold and unassuming. He placed a small pile of kindling into the belly of the box and watched as it ignited quickly. The stove box rumbled softly, and for a moment Jacob was unsure whether his invention would perform as he'd hoped. But then the warmth began to spread. It started slow, like the first rays of sun piercing through the dark clouds of the early morning. But soon the warmth radiated outward, filling the room. Jacob could feel the change in the air, the once chilled corners now infused with a gentle heat. He moved his chair closer to the stove, a feeling of satisfaction warming him more than the fire itself. But as the night wore on, he could hear the creaks of the other cabins around him. He could hear the muffled coughs of the neighbors, the crackling of their fireplaces, and the rattle of their windows in the wind. Jacob's stove, however, kept working, its heat steady, its warmth moving to every part of the room. By morning the storm had not abated, but Jacob was content. The stove box had done its job. It had kept the room warm throughout the night, not just in one corner, but across the whole room. The firewood, too, had burned slowly, just as Jacob had designed it to. In the days that followed, Jacob continued to tend to the stove box with a quiet reverence. He made small adjustments here and there, tweaking the air vents and adding more kindling, but for the most part, the stove did the work it was meant to. Then, as the winter wore on and more snowstorms hit, Jacob's neighbors began to take notice. Ezra, who had laughed at the stove box, arrived one afternoon, his face red and weathered from the cold. He stood in the doorway eyeing the stove. Jacob knew what was coming before he even spoke. "I've been hearing things about your stove box," Ezra said. "Said it's keeping you warm all night long?" Jacob stood by the stove, watching the flames flicker. "That's right," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about it," Ezra said, stepping inside. "Maybe it's worth a try." Jacob nodded, stepping aside to let his neighbor see for himself. They stood there for a while, watching the fire burn steady and true. And for the first time, Jacob saw the doubt in Ezra's eyes begin to lift. "Maybe it's time to stop laughing at the fool's box," Ezra said softly. Jacob smiled. "Maybe." The days grew colder, and the sky above Lancaster seemed to darken with a vengeance. Jacob had lived through many winters in the heart of the Pennsylvania countryside, but this one was proving to be like no other. The storms had come early and often, and each one seemed fiercer than the last. By the time January rolled in, the ground had been frozen solid for weeks, and the snow lay thick like a blanket over the land, muting the world in a quiet, unyielding chill. Inside Jacob's cabin, the stove box burned steadily. It had proven itself to be more than a mere invention. It had become a lifeline. The warmth it provided was consistent and reliable, and it was not just the comfort of the heat that Jacob appreciated, but the deep sense of security it gave him. For the first time in years, he could sit by his window and watch the snowstorm rage outside without feeling the cold creeping in through the walls. It was during this harsh month that Ezra came knocking once again, this time without a word of mockery. His face was pale, his clothes heavy with the weight of the winter. Jacob let him in without hesitation, offering a cup of hot tea and a seat by the stove. "I can't deny it any more," Ezra said, his voice almost drowned by the wind howling outside. "Your stove box! It's the only thing keeping this place warm." The other cabins, well, we're all feeling the bite of the cold, but you're different. You've been keeping that stove going every night. I'm not sure how, but it's working. It's keeping you warm." Jacob nodded, watching the flames dance in the stove box. "It's simple, really," he said, stirring the tea. "Just like building a good barn or planting a row of corn. You do it right, and it works. I've learned that much." Ezra glanced at the stove once more. "You've done more than just that. You've got yourself a winter to last." The storm raged on that night, and as the winds picked up to an unrelenting howl, Jacob sat quietly, the warmth of the stove box at his back. It had already been a long and exhausting season, but Jacob was grateful for the small things, the steady burn of the stove, the simple act of turning a wheel, and the quiet strength it gave him. He realized, too, that the ridicule from his neighbors had started to fade into the background. What had once been a source of mockery was now a symbol of wisdom. As the days turned into weeks, more neighbors came to Jacob's cabin. One by one, they asked questions about the stove box, how it worked, how to keep it running, how to maintain the fire so that it would last the entire night. They no longer saw the stove as foolish. They saw it as a practical, wise solution to a deadly problem. By the end of January, the other homes in Lancaster had been forced to use every bit of wood they had. The fires burned low, and the cold crept into every crevice of their homes. but not Jacob's. The stove box continued to burn steadily, the heat spreading through his cabin, filling the space with a sense of peace that couldn't be rivaled by the harsh winter outside. Jacob had known all along that building for the worst was the only way to guarantee survival. And now, as he watched the weary faces of his neighbors huddled by his stove, he understood that the worst had come, but they would survive it together. By the time February arrived, Jacob had become the quiet cornerstone of Lancaster's community. His cabin had become a gathering place, where neighbors huddled for warmth, shared stories, and began to understand that Jacob's foresight wasn't foolishness, but wisdom born from necessity. Ezra, who had once laughed at the stove box, was now the first to offer a helping hand whenever Jacob needed more firewood. He had come to see Jacob's resourcefulness not as a matter of pride, but as an example of a humble man who understood the deeper rhythm of nature. The community had been tested by the winter's unrelenting cold, and those who had prepared, those like Jacob, had found themselves less vulnerable to its cruelty. But as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, a different kind of cold crept into Lancaster. Jacob's neighbors, who had once stood by, waiting for the worst to pass, now looked to him for guidance. They had learned from him, yes, but they also resented him. The pride that had kept them from acknowledging the stove box as a worthy invention had now turned into something sharper: resentment. One evening Ezra arrived at Jacob's cabin, his face drawn and his voice edged with tension. "Jacob," he said, not meeting his gaze, "I know I've asked you for help before, but now it's different. I need your advice, but I need you to understand something. You didn't just build a stove box, you built a reputation that's hard to ignore." Jacob set his tools down, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said quietly. The fire crackled in the stove, its soft hum filling the room. Ezra sighed, his shoulders heavy with unspoken words. "The others, they think you're better than us now. They think because you built that stove and had the foresight to see what was coming, you've got all the answers. But Jacob, nobody's perfect, and you might not always be right." Jacob felt the weight of Ezra's words hang in the air. It was the first time anyone had said anything like this to him. He had thought, after the storm, that the worst was over, that his neighbors would simply learn to respect him. But now, with this conversation, he realized that respect was a fragile thing, easily lost and not so easily regained. "I didn't build that stove to prove anything," Jacob said softly, looking into the flames. "I built it because I had to, because I knew the winter would come. And if you're still angry, Ezra, I understand, but I did what I thought was right." Ezra stood in silence for a moment before nodding slowly. "I know. And I know we all should have built like you. It's hard. The pride we've held on to, sometimes it gets in the way. But I think maybe we've learned something this year. Maybe, just maybe, it's time to learn from you for once." Jacob didn't say another word. He simply watched the fire. He knew that change was slow, that in the end, pride had its own cost. But he also knew that in the quiet hum of his stove box, the real lessons were being learned, one neighbor at a time. The spring thaw had begun to break the icy grip of winter, but the lessons learned from the harsh months of snow and cold still lingered in the hearts of the people of Lancaster. Jacob Stoltzfus had, in many ways, become the reluctant teacher of the valley. His stove box, once ridiculed as a foolish invention, had not only kept his cabin warm through the worst storms, but had become a symbol of quiet strength, foresight, and humility. By early April, the snow had receded, and the trees began to show signs of life once again. Jacob's cabin was quiet, no longer a place for groups to gather, but a refuge for those seeking to make sense of the season that had nearly broken them. Even so, the remnants of winter still cast long shadows over the land, and in those shadows, old pride and resentments took root. Ezra was one of the first to arrive on Jacob's doorstep that morning, his heavy boots crunching against the frozen earth. It had been weeks since the storm had passed, and the air now held the warmth of the coming season, yet Ezra still had a weariness in his eyes. Jacob welcomed him inside, offering him a seat by the stove, a place that now, unlike in the bitter cold months before, felt symbolic of the warmth they had all come to know. "I've been thinking," Ezra said quietly, glancing at the stove box. "The winter may be over, but the changes it brought aren't. I've come to realize, Jacob, I was wrong. We all were. I thought you were foolish, building that stove, but I see now what it means to be prepared." Jacob nodded, waiting. He didn't feel the need to speak yet, knowing that Ezra had more to say. "It's not just about the stove," Ezra continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's about something deeper. It's about trusting yourself when others laugh. It's about having the courage to stand by what you believe, even when everyone around you calls it foolish. That's what I've learned from you. And I think I speak for more than just myself when I say that we've all been too proud. I know I have." Jacob didn't speak for a long moment. He felt the weight of Ezra's words sink in, felt the tenderness of his neighbor's humility. There was something sacred in this quiet. Confession, a softness that hadn't existed before, when pride had been the currency of every conversation. "I never meant to make anyone feel small," Jacob said, his voice low but steady. "I built that stove because I had to, not for praise, not for recognition. I just saw a need and thought I could fill it, but I'm glad it helped." Ezra stood and walked over to the stove, gently laying a hand on the stone base. "It helped more than you know," he said quietly. "And it wasn't just the warmth you gave us, it was the lesson of humility. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's about who's willing to do the work and face what's coming. And for that, Jacob, I can never thank you enough." Jacob smiled faintly, watching his neighbor turn to leave. "We're in this together, Ezra. I think we've all learned something this winter." As Ezra walked out the door, Jacob stood at the window, watching him disappear into the budding landscape. For the first time in many months, Jacob felt a deep, unshakable peace settle over him. The cold had tested them all, but it had also taught them something far more valuable than mere survival. It had taught them what it meant to truly live in community. By the time summer arrived, Lancaster had settled into a rhythm. The harsh winter was a distant memory, though its lessons were still fresh in the minds of the people. The stove box, once mocked as a foolish invention, had become a symbol of resilience, not just for Jacob, but for the entire community. It had kept them alive through the long months of cold, but more than that, it had shaped the way they saw one another. The division that had once existed between Jacob and his neighbors, the divide created by pride, ignorance, and ridicule, had softened. It was replaced with an understanding forged in the fire of hardship. Jacob continued to tend to his farm, working the land with the same quiet determination that had always guided him. The rhythm of his days was simple: feeding the animals, plowing the fields, mending fences. But as he worked, he often found himself thinking of the stove box and the strange way it had brought him closer to his neighbors. He had not set out to be a leader, nor had he ever desired the spotlight, but in some small way, that stove box had placed him in a position of quiet influence. Ezra was one of the many who now came to Jacob's cabin, not just for help or advice, but to sit with him in the evenings. They shared stories, exchanged ideas about farming, and talked about the lessons they had learned over the past year. The stove box, though no longer needed to ward off the winter cold, remained in the cabin as a quiet reminder of the past. It stood there in the corner, its iron surface worn but sturdy, its stone foundation unyielding. One afternoon, as Jacob was repairing the roof of his barn, Ezra approached him with a thoughtful look on his face. "Jacob," he said, his voice serious, "I've been thinking about the stove box and about what you did. You didn't just change how we keep warm in the winter, you changed how we think about everything. We've always rushed to do things, always looking for the quickest, easiest way out. But now we see that taking our time, building with care, building for the worst, matters more than we realized. Jacob looked at Ezra and smiled. "It's simple, really," he replied. "When you build with care, you're not just building something to survive. You're building something that lasts. You're building something that can stand the test of time." Ezra nodded, then handed Jacob a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I want you to have this," he said. "It's from all of us. A token of appreciation. You've taught us more than just how to stay warm. You've taught us what it means to live well, even in the harshest of conditions." Jacob unwrapped the cloth, revealing a hand-carved wooden plaque with a simple inscription, "Built to last." His heart swelled with a quiet pride, but not for himself, for the community that had come together, for the way their hearts had been softened by a lesson that had nothing to do with firewood or stoves, and everything to do with humility and trust. "That's a good lesson to remember," Jacob said softly, his fingers tracing the inscription, "and one we'll all carry with us, always." As the summer sun set on Lancaster, Jacob stood in the quiet of his cabin, the warmth of the stove box now a memory, but the impact of its lesson everlasting. The winter had come and gone, but the legacy of the stove box, the legacy of preparing for the worst, of building with care, and of living in community, was just beginning to take root. And for Jacob, that was more than enough. The seasons moved forward, and as the days lengthened and the crops in Lancaster grew tall and green, Jacob Stoltzfus found that his farm was thriving as never before. The summer had been gentle, the rains coming in steady rhythms, nurturing the earth that had given so much in return. The farm's barn, standing sturdy on its new foundation, was now filled with hay and supplies, while the vegetables in the fields ripened in the summer heat. Yet despite the peace and prosperity that surrounded him, Jacob's heart carried an unease he couldn't quite shake. The stove box had been a turning point, not just in the lives of Jacob and his neighbors, but in the way the community viewed what it meant to truly help one another. He had often found comfort in solitude, in working with his hands to create solutions for problems that no one else seemed to see. But the deeper Jacob reflected, the more he realized that his own wisdom, quiet and reserved as it was not meant to stay hidden in the walls of his cabin. It was meant to be shared, passed on to those who might need it, in ways he could never fully understand. It was the lesson he had learned all those months ago when his neighbors had come to his door seeking shelter from the cold. And so, one evening, after another long day of work, Jacob sat at his kitchen table, a faint smile crossing his face as he thought about what needed to happen next. He reached for a piece of paper and began to write. It was a letter addressed to the men of Lancaster, inviting them to gather at his cabin. He didn't know how they would respond, whether they would view his invitation as unnecessary or intrusive. But it didn't matter. The time for waiting was over. The stove box had proven that a single man's effort could change the lives of many. Now, it was time to offer them something more. The next morning, Jacob posted the letter at the general store in town. The words were simple, unpretentious, much like the man himself. "Gentlemen of Lancaster, I invite you to my home next Sunday after the evening meal to discuss the lessons we've learned this winter. It's not only about survival, but about how we build and live together in this community. If you're interested, I'd be glad to share what I've learned and hear your thoughts on the matter. Come when you can. There's always room for one more at the table. Jacob Stoltzfus." He felt a weight lift from his shoulders the moment the letter was hung. Whether or not they would come, whether they would see the value of sharing what they had all learned, Jacob didn't know. But he felt in his heart that this was the right thing to do, and that was enough. The days leading up to that Sunday evening were filled with a quiet anticipation. Jacob went about his work with a sense of urgency, as though preparing for something important, though he couldn't yet explain why. He harvested the last of the root vegetables from the garden, stacked firewood in neat piles, and began preparing a simple meal to share with those who would come. His thoughts often returned to the stove box, to the people who had once thought it a foolish invention. But now it seemed to have become more than just a source of warmth. It had become a foundation upon which deeper lessons could be built. On Sunday afternoon, Jacob set the table with bread, cheese, and the vegetables he had harvested, placing them in the center of the wooden table that had seen so many family meals. The evening air was cool, the first hint of fall in the breeze, and as the sun began to sink below the horizon, Jacob heard the familiar sound of wagon wheels crunching across the gravel path. One by one, his neighbors began to arrive. Ezra, who had once laughed at Jacob's stove, was the first to step inside, his face warm and welcoming. He nodded to Jacob with a silent acknowledgement before taking a seat by the fire. "Evening, Jacob," he said with a smile. "I've been thinking a lot about what you wrote. What you said about the stove, it's true, but it's also about more than just the stove, isn't it?" Jacob smiled, grateful for the understanding that had grown between them. "Yes," he said, "it's about what we build together. Not just cabins or stoves, but lives." As the evening wore on, the men of Lancaster filtered into the cabin, each one bringing with them something, whether it was firewood to contribute or a story to share. The warmth of the stove box seemed to spread beyond the room, filling the space with more than just heat. There was a sense of unity that had been missing before, and Jacob could feel it deep in his bones. They talked for hours that evening, long after the last of the meal had been eaten and the last of the logs in the stove had turned to embers. Jacob shared his thoughts on the winter that had passed, how it had changed them all, and how the simple act of preparation, of building not for what they knew but for what they feared, had made all the difference. And though Jacob had been the one to build the stove box, the conversation turned quickly from individual accomplishments to the work that needed to be done as a community. One of the men, Thomas, a blacksmith who had lived in Lancaster for many years, looked at Jacob and asked, "What do we do now? How do we continue this new way of thinking?" Jacob took a deep breath, staring into the flickering flames of the stove box. "We continue by building with care," he said simply. "We continue by helping each other. We've learned a lot this winter, but there's still work to be done. If we can build this way, with each other in mind, then I think we'll be ready for whatever comes next." The men nodded, some of them offering quiet words of agreement. It wasn't the loud cheers of celebration that filled the room, it was the gentle murmurs of understanding. In that moment, Jacob knew that something had shifted in Lancaster, something deeper than just survival. They had begun to build not just structures, but a community that would stand strong, no matter the storms that might come. As the evening came to a close and the last of the men left, Jacob stood by the door, watching them walk back into the night. He felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that what had started with a simple stove box had now become something much larger, a way of life that valued foresight, humility, and the strength of working together. The legacy of the stove box, Jacob realized, wasn't just about what it had kept warm. It was about what it had helped to build, a community bound together by the quiet wisdom of preparing for the future, no matter how uncertain it might be. Months passed and Lancaster flourished. The crops grew tall under the sun, the barns filled with hay and grain, and the community seemed more united than ever. Yet as the years rolled on, a quiet challenge began to stir. The lessons of the harsh winter, once shared and accepted, began to fade in the minds of some. The stove box, that humble creation of Jacob's, remained a fixture in his cabin, but with the new warmth of summer, its lessons seemed distant to many. Jacob watched silently as his neighbors returned to their old ways. They still worked hard and cared for one another, but the urgency that had once brought them together began to dissipate. The stove box, though still functional, stood as a reminder of something that was slowly being forgotten. One evening, as Jacob worked in his garden, Ezra approached, a concerned look on his face. "Jacob," he began, "I've been thinking. The way we came together after the winter, it was something special. But lately, I'm afraid we've let it slip." Jacob nodded slowly, sensing the weight of his friend's words. "I see it too," he said quietly. "But maybe that's the way it goes. People forget when the storm has passed and life moves on." Ezra looked at the stove box, still standing in the corner of Jacob's cabin. "It doesn't have to fade," he said, his voice firm. "Maybe it's time we remind ourselves why we built it in the first place." Jacob smiled, knowing that the seed of renewal had been planted once again. "We can't forget, Ezra. Not really. We'll keep building, one small act at a time." The seasons turned once more, but this time something had shifted in Lancaster. The old ways of building, rushed and hasty, were no longer enough. The lessons of Jacob's stove box had found a place in the hearts of those who had been there in the beginning. Slowly but surely, a new rhythm had taken hold in the community. Neighbors helped each other with more than just words. They offered time, effort, and foresight. Jacob, though now older, still worked with the same quiet resolve. The stove box was a fixture in his cabin, but its significance had grown far beyond its purpose as a heater. It was a symbol of a deeper truth, that when you build for the worst, you ensure survival, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. As the years went on, the people of Lancaster came together whenever a storm threatened, working side by side to prepare for whatever came their way. The spirit of resilience that had been born from that one winter was now woven into the fabric of their lives. And when Jacob looked back at his cabin, now filled with grandchildren and the laughter of his family, he knew that his simple creation had left a legacy of care, preparation, and community that would live on for generations.